Hello, fellow horse nerds. It's Rupert Isaacson again, tackling the history of this thing that we call dressage. This is the third of our videos. I will try to keep it to the roughly 35-minute mark. Apologies if I go over. If you like what we do, please give it a thumbs up, like it, subscribe it. Really helps. All right, and I'm also going to do a shout out, as I always do, to the Xenophon Press for giving us these amazing books that we can all work from. Do buy their books. They rock. Okay, so 17th century. In the previous video, we looked at the medieval period into the 16th century, and we discovered that at the end of the 16th century in Italy, there was a dude called Pignatelli, who the later dudes, who become really important, all seem to agree was the dude. They're like, dude, that dude was like the dude. And all these guys here writing are like, yeah, dude, that dude was the dude, like that dude, he was the dude. However, unfortunately, we haven't really got anything written by Pignatelli. It hasn't survived the ages, except it did. It turns out that about 2 or 3 years ago, a manuscript did come to light. It's in Italian, and I am busy having a friend of mine, Dr. Amanda Minervini, translate it, and we are going to do a video on that. We're also going to stay with Europe here. But remember that from the 16th century onwards, horsemanship has gone to the Americas as well. Spanish, Portuguese horsemanship that becomes all the Western horsemanship and so on. So we are going to cover that in videos as well. So do hang on for that. But right now we're going to stay within Europe. Okay. In the previous video, we also realized that at the end of the 16th century, with Protestantism coming in, and all this money coming in from the New World fueling the papacy, well, of course, you get massive religious wars. And especially the French are looking at Spain going, man, these guys are just dominating the economic scene here. We could challenge them, but we can't do that as long as we're fighting these civil wars. And a guy called Antoine de Pluvinel and another guy called Salomon de la Brue have gone and learned in Italy and have brought back this ordered academic horsemanship to France. They're not the only ones, but they write really seminal books. Pluvinel ends up being the keeper of the royal stables in the early 17th century in France, and he goes to the French king and basically says, sire, our aristocracy is out of control. We have been now involved in about, however many decades of civil war, Protestant and Catholic. We will never rival Spain. We will never be able to dominate Europe as our economy should, unless we can get control of our aristocracy. Now, I have noticed that if people learn this kind of horsemanship, sire, it tends to turn them into slightly more self-regulated emotionally dudes. This was also written about by ancient dudes like Xenophon, father of Stoic philosophy, ancient Greece, 400 BC, also wrote about the effect of horsemanship this way. It seems that when you have to train these highly sensitive animals in this highly complex way, you kind of have to get control of yourself. And this is good. And maybe we should have some academies within France where instead of them going down to Italy to learn this stuff, we could do it right here in France. And instead of these young aristocrats all fighting duels with each other, which then breaks up the estates and breaks up our agricultural economy, or as they get older, fighting little civil wars with each other, maybe we could kind of get control from the top down over this thing, and use horsemanship, which we need for battle anyway, and of course, which seems to create a sort of elegant courtier. And we talked in the previous video about how Renaissance Italy's horsemanship created the idea of the courtier and the diplomat, not just the mounted warrior. Maybe if we do this, sire, we can become the dominant force in Europe, and the king goes for it. And that is kind of what happened, actually. And that is why we have the word dressage. And that is why we have the word Piaffe. And that is why we have the word passage. And that is why we have renvers and travers and all this other French stuff. Why? Well, because the French clever chaps, the French, were the first ones to put a kind of a national stud kind of thing over it and regularize it. And of course, all the other European powers at the time looked at that and went, good idea. French very quickly became the language of diplomacy across Europe. And whether you were Russian, whether you were German, whether you were English, you all spoke French. And partly that was in reaction against Spain. And France, even though it was technically a Catholic country, had a strong Protestant presence, and it would sometimes ally with Protestant powers if it decided that that was in its interests against Spain, always trying to counter Spain. And all these other European powers in the 17th century, Britain, Netherlands, etc., the rise of Russia, looking out at the rest of the world going, we could get some of that action. We could get some empire, couldn't we? Yeah, we could do that. And so the need to begin to organize your economy, organize your aristocracy, organize your tax base, organize your agriculture, organize your mining, organize your transportation, organize your horse training, organize your horse breeding, starts to become a priority. For the first time since the Romans, suddenly you get, in the 17th century in Europe, standing armies, instead of just, as in the medieval and Renaissance period, where you'd have like the Duke of whoever, and Lord Puff Buttock over there, showing up with X hundred men, and then you'd also have to get, these mercenaries in from over there, which might switch sides during the war. It was all very chaotic and expensive. No. Suddenly we want to have, just like the Romans did, an army that is trained, fed, housed, armed, treated, etc., by the state. You can only do this when you've got vast amounts of money coming in, like the Romans did. Well, this begins to happen now. So horse training comes under this, and that's why we have all these French words, because the French, with Pluvinel and de la Brue, are the first ones to get in on that action and really make it a nationalized type of thing. So Antoine de Pluvinel, he's really just doing what the Italian masters were doing in the 16th century, who are really just doing what the Spanish and Portuguese have been doing forever. But he's got a political motive for it, and that gets exported out to the rest of Europe. So dressage becomes a thing. Okay, Pluvinel and his academies are not the only thing that goes on in the 17th century in terms of leaving us books that we can follow. There's also an English dude, and he's called William Cavendish, and he is the Duke of Newcastle. However, even though he's a Brit, he learns his stuff in France and Belgium. Why? Because he ends up on the wrong side of the English Civil War. He's a royalist. The royalists do not win in the mid-17th century, and he ends up, for quite some decades, having to live in exile in France, and then he's brought back to England in the 1660s. And he also writes a book detailing how to train these horses in this way. Now, let's talk about the actual horse training. Let's go over some things that are useful to know. We talked about in the previous video how the Italian dudes used these small vaults, these small circles, and began to talk more and more about putting the inside hind under the horse's point of gravity to dress him, to bring him together, to collect him, and then working in these combinations of vaults, a little bit similar to the working equitation patterns that we might see today, which were really useful in combat. They also talk about the airs above the ground, and there's a debate that's been raging forever and will rage forever about whether people used these things in battle or not. There are pictures of horses using airs in battle that survive from 15th century Italy. If you want to look at Paolo Uccello's Battle of San Romano, you'll see horses being trained to kick out and that sort of thing in that. But some people, even among the old masters, said, well, actually, these are things you just do for fun and balletic reasons in the manege, in the riding school. And other people say, no, you actually did use them on the battlefield. So presumably there was a bit of both going on. So Okay, they also are advocates of using the pillars. And the pillars is not just the double pillars that we might see today in the Spanish Riding School of Vienna, which are a great tool, and we certainly use them ourselves. If you want to develop the Piaffe into a really artistic form, they're amazing. If you want to really muscle the horse over the loin, they're amazing. They're great for teaching the airs above the ground as well. But they also talk about something which is sort of rather gone from modern dressage, which is the use of the single pillar. And it's one pillar that stands kind of like a tree, and the horse is attached to it by a cavisson, and they kind of go round it, and it's called the work on two tracks. And we would recognize that as a sort of leg yield in the circle, or what the French would call chasser les hanches, chase the haunches. They really relied on this two-track work in ultra collection, first in the walk, then in the trot, and then in the canter, which then becomes a two-beat canter, which we would call terre à terre today, meaning ground to ground in French, or metzer when you add a bit of power to it, meaning the mid-air canter. It's a two-beat canter instead of a three-beat canter. So instead of going do, 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 the horse goes ba-boom, 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 like a rocking horse. And that's, of course, how you can get to the airs above the ground. You need those to have the power to leave the ground. Okay. Pluvinel writes, by the way, I like to joke that he had an English cousin called Bloody Hell. So Pluvinel, the French dude, he really advocates in quite a clear way how to do this work on two tracks without a pillar. And so much so that I actually had a go at it myself with a couple of my ponies and found that it really, really works. You use this, what we call a geovolta, which is today, we would call it in our own program pattern 1A, which is like a leg yield in a circle. You do it with a cavisson until the horse is really comfortable doing that at the walk. Then you begin to add little trot steps. And with the kind of Baroque breeds, they begin to offer Piaffe quite easily out of this. With non-Baroque breeds, they do not. And remember that this is the Baroque period now, 17th and then into the 18th century. So we're talking about Baroque horses here that collect very, very easily, sort of to some degree come out of their mother's wombs in collection. Other types of horses, not so much. So I've really used this with Lusitanos and Spanish horses and other Baroque breeds really well. Okay, so you start in that vault, and then you add these trot steps, which become really, really, really collected, and you get bits of Piaffe, you get bits of passage. Then you ask for the canter, and usually I will ask for it in the same way that I'll ask on the lunge. I've got a particular vocal cue I like, and I do this little skippy step, and the horse gets the idea, ooh, I can canter in this very, very tight little volta with my inside hind coming underneath me. And that eventually, if I begin to tap in a rhythm on the croup of the horse, and all of this is described in there, he'll begin to do a two-beat canter, and then I can do the Piaffe passage thing to the wall in a bit of a leg yield out of that little vault, and begin to get my levard, and then I can get what people now call a croupade, which is different from the croupade that these guys were talking about, which is a kick. The people think of the croupade as leaving the ground with awful feet. We'll get into why there's confusion between these terms in different places in another video. And then you begin to put it all together and you get your ballotard, which is a small jump and a kick back, like a mini capriole. And then if your horse has enough muscle and power, usually it's a stallion, you can begin to get the capriole from that. And we've in our program, the Helios Harmony program, worked to his book, and it works. It totally works. So if you come and study with us, we'll do it with you. Okay, William Cavendish is more or less doing the same thing. They also begin to talk a lot here about the need to not be cruel. So the early Italian guys in the 16th century, like Grisone, they have a bad reputation for being like all about the punishments and the only reward being that kind of absence of pain and like domination and stuff. But Xenophon, way back in 400 BC, is saying, no, man, your horse got to like you. You got to be nice to your horse. You got to have love. And these guys begin to go into this as well, saying, look, in order to get control over yourself, you can't just be punishing your horse all the time. And that's all chaotic. Everything's got to be, nice and regularized and balanced, which means you've got to be balanced internally here and here. as well as in your movements. And this is going to serve you very well on the battlefield. Keep your head. And this is also going to serve you very well when you are negotiating deals as a courtier or a diplomat. And it starts with the horsemanship. So they talk about some interesting things like don't use your heels too much, don't kick too much, don't use your spurs too much, because it actually, William Cavendish talks about this, it makes your horse want to go backwards and not forwards. They talk about the needs to design bits specific to your horse. They talk about saddle fitting to be nicer for the horse. They go into all this stuff. And like all the old masters, they also talk about the needs for, not just the high school stuff, but also basic battle horse, basic carriage horse, basic veterinary stuff, and so on. Okay. They also are intellectuals. So William Cavendish he's there in Bolsover Castle in sort of middle North England, and he becomes a patron of a seminal English playwright called Ben Jonson. And when you're thinking about the next person in English literature after Shakespeare, Jonson is really like one of the big names. He is his principal patron, and he's also at the center of a group of intellectuals called the Welbeck Circle. The Welbeck Circle was not just about literature, it was also about science, and they were particularly interested actually in the development of optics, and this is where you're getting into the circles also of people like Isaac Newton and so on. So the point being that the intellectual traditions that we see starting with Xenophon back in ancient Greece, going through the Italian dead dudes, now going into the 17th century with English and French dead dudes, they're not like a lot of us today as horsemen. A lot of horsemen today are kind of anti-intellectual in a weird way. I just like horses. I don't like people. I'm not interested in anything but horses. This wasn't these guys. They were interested in everything. They were what you call polymaths. And it is worth considering that this need for constant curiosity is, of course, what fed the development of dressage. So they would be the first to advocate that you shouldn't just be a dressage person, or you shouldn't just be a horse person. You should also be interested in all the arts and sciences as well. Take it from the old dead dudes. All right. So right about the end of this 17th century period, you have something weird that happens. Even though William Cavendish, he's really the last person within the UK that we can look to for anything dressage until quite a couple of hundred years later. Why? Because remember the French saying, "Oh, we want to challenge this empire thing that the Spanish are doing." Well, of course, the Brits said the same thing, and so did the Dutch, and so did quite a few others. And the Brits got kind of good at it. And at the end of the 17th century, the English colonial adventure really begins into the 18th century. And it begins to be about ships and infantry, because you're not going to put thousands and thousands of horses on ships. We stop as England fighting our wars in Europe most of the time. Occasionally we have a big blow up with the French, but most of it now is going to go on the Americas and India and places like that. And we also begin an obsession with speed at the end of the 17th century. And this is the thoroughbred horse, the invention of the thoroughbred horse. And we also have this thing called the Enclosures Acts beginning, where we cut down a bunch of forests, close a bunch of common land, partly to make ships, partly to get control of the aristocracy, who were also fighting a bunch of civil wars, and saying, no, we want a rural middle class who will be loyal to the crown and pay their taxes, because the aristocrats don't ever pay their taxes. And with this thoroughbred horse that comes in and this cleared land, you get all these hedges and banks in rectangles around all this newly cleared land, and hunting changes and becomes about chasing small animals, fox, hare, fast across these newly opened enclosed areas. You've got to jump the fences, as opposed to the old way of hunting big animals, stag, boar, wolf, slowly through big forests in the old medieval style, like they still do, for example, in France today. So thoroughbred horse, speed, jumping, this type of leisure riding begins to replace the need for high school military, dressage riding. And the crossover point, this is for you real nerds, is a thing called the Battle of the Boyne, which is a battle that happens in Ireland that decides whether England finally will be Protestant or Catholic. And it happens at the end of the 17th century. The Protestants win. On the side of the Protestants is an Anglo-Irish nobleman called Byerley, who's an interesting dude. A bit earlier, the Ottoman Empire was pushing into Europe, also great horsemen. We're going to do some videos on them. And they got as far as Vienna. And the rest of the European powers, who up until that point, of course, had always been fighting each other, kind of went, ooh, we can't have that. We better all get together, a bit like the Crusades, and fight these guys off. And so at the Siege of Vienna, which the Europeans do win, there are English and Irish people fighting there as well as all the other Europeans. One of them is this guy called Byerley, and he acquires this horse. It's called the Byerley Turk. And it seems to have been as good of a battle horse, which means it must have been a dressage horse as well, as it was fast. And then he gets this horse, whether he steals it, whether he wins it in battle, whether he trades for it with Ottoman nobles, we don't quite know. And he shows up at the Battle of the Boyne in Ireland. He's on the winning side in that battle too with this horse. And then he puts this horse out to stud out there in County Meath, on that good grass that they've got. And he's one of the founding stallions of the thoroughbred horse. So the obsession with speed, funnily enough, does still have a little bit of a dressage route there with the Byerley Turk, but then it very quickly goes away from that. And the thing with learning to ride and jump and hunt really fast, which is how I grew up, is it's not riding in 3 dimensions. It's not as complex to learn as all the dressage stuff where you've got to learn how to put the hind legs under the horse and all of that. So it became, much easier. And of course, it's a lot of fun. It's high adrenaline. It's what you call great crack to go over these big fences and, take a risk. So this really becomes the dominant thing within the English tradition. And then, of course, in the Americas, in the colonies, Virginia, New England, and down into the Carolinas and Georgia, this becomes the prevailing form of riding as well, and throughout the rest of the empire. And if we need to, as the Brits, fight close order cavalry battles, like say in India, we'll hire the locals to do that. We'll hire the Rajputs, we'll hire the guys from the Punjab, etc., the Sikhs. Why? Because they're the inheritors of the cavalry dressage tradition that went east in the ancient world long before it went west. So we can just use these local guys. That's fine. We'll have them as cavalry. However, in Europe, warfare still ends up being dominated by cavalry, because you're through the 17th century, where you have this thing called the 30 Years' War, which is cataclysmic. I'm sitting here in Germany, and at the start of the 30 Years' War, the population of Germany, which is bang in the middle, it's where the war gets mostly fought, is about 12 million at the end. I think 1648 by the Peace of Munda. It's gone down to 4 million. And that's before the age of weapons of mass destruction. You had to really try hard to kill that many millions of people back then, but they did. So it was during the course of that 30 Years' War that all of the economies of Europe realized that, like France, they had to basically create a military economy funded by the state, like the Roman Empire, which would also then, of course, drive an industrial and agricultural revolution. So the roots of the Industrial Revolution are there. And horses still dominate the scene. So in the next video, we're going to go into the 18th century, and we're going to deal with the super cool dead dude, the Zeus of the Pantheon, François Robuchon de la Guérinière, but some others as well. And we're going to look at how they go from this training in the small vaulter, putting the inside hind underneath, to now learning how to put the outside hind underneath, because they start breeding the horses bigger, and they start moving away from the strictly Baroque type of horse. And that's obviously of great interest to people riding today, because they're riding breeds of horse like warmbloods or whatever, thoroughbreds, that are not as easy to collect as the Iberian horses, the Lusitanos, the Spanish horses, and so on. Suddenly you get into how to take a kind of more modern kind of horse and dress it. All right, so hold on for the next video. We'll go into the 18th century, and then following videos, we'll go into the New World and we'll talk about the Ottomans, and we'll also talk about medieval as well. For now, if this was useful, please like, please subscribe. Really helps get this work out there. If you'd like to come and train with us with our own horses, whether it's in handwork or ridden work, you're very welcome to contact us. To our online program where you can go from 0 to Piaffe in hand using all these old techniques. Helios is the website if you want to do that. But the most important thing, please like and subscribe. We'll see you on the next Old Dead Dudes video.